Welcome to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, hosted by Dr. Katharine Stevens. Early Matters features in-depth conversations with leading researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on what matters most for young children and their families to thrive.
Welcome to Early Matters. I'm Katharine Stevens, your host and founder and CEO of the Center on Child and Family Policy. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Professor Brad Wilcox, who is a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His research is focused on marriage, fatherhood, and cohabitation, especially on the ways that family structure, civil society, and culture influence the quality and stability of family life in the United States and around the globe. He also focuses on exploring the contribution that families make to the economic welfare and general well-being of individuals and societies. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be here with you, Katharine.
So, as you know, my focus is primarily on advancing the well-being of young children. We know that young children thrive in strong families, and you argue that families are much strengthened in turn by marriage. Can you talk about why you view marriage in particular as so crucial to family strength and well-being?
Yeah, thanks, Katharine. Happy to do so. And I also want to just, before I begin answering your question, just also kind of acknowledge, right up front that many kids obviously thrive in a variety of family types. I was raised by a single mother. I'm not saying that the only way to do this is through marriage, but it's important to acknowledge too, as a social scientist who's been studying these issues for about 20 years, that in general, on average, kids are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of their own married parents, stably married parents. And there are a couple of reasons that's the case. One reason, of course, is that if you've babysat for kids, taught kids, played with kids, they thrive on stability. And, marriage is the most stable kind of family form that we have here in the U.S. So part of this is about stability. We know also, too, that in general, kids and families do better with more economic resources. And married parents today have a lot more money than their cohabiting and single peers as well. And that's in part, too, because just marriage tends to engender more prudent patterns of spending and saving as well, compared to, say, cohabiting, for instance. So, again, part of the story about marriage is a financial piece. And then I think, too, there's just something about, sort of the symbolic character of marriage in people's lives. I mean, it's the one thing where people kind of come together typically, either in a church or nowadays in a barn or a beautiful spot, and make public commitments before family and friends. And there's something about this sort of ritualized commitment that is linked to more stability, more salience for couples in ways that are meaningful as well. And so kind of being part of this storied institution seems to matter for adults, but also for kids. And I was talking to a married couple now with two young daughters recently. And when I first spoke to them for some research, they were cohabiting. When I spoke to them the second time, they were married. And the dad was kind of talking about how getting married was, a big deal for his daughters. They kind of had this instinctive sense that it was great that mommy and daddy were now married. So those are a couple of reasons why I think marriage matters. And I would just also kind of note that in general, when it comes to marriage as well, that parents are more likely to be not just wealthier or more prosperous, more financially secure when they're married, but they're also more likely to be good parents, to be authoritative, to be active with their kids, to be emotionally attentive and not to be abusive. And that's in part because having the benefit of a spouse in the home means that you get support when you're exhausted as a parent, and also means that there's someone there unseen if you're losing your temper to kind of say, hey, I think you should just take a break from all this or just go take a walk. And so we just know that on average, again, the kind of parenting that's done in a married home is on average more authoritative and less either permissive or abusive than you would see in other family contexts.
Yes. So here we are discussing marriage. This is the whole topic of this conversation. I can imagine that someone living, say, 75 years ago would think this was kind of a bizarre conversation, that we were kind of belaboring this point. Can you talk about how marriage has changed over the last, say, century, both in terms of rates of marriage and who's married? Why are we at this point feeling, or why are you feeling, that we need to be as paying such deliberate attention to this area of human life?
Yeah, great question. So obviously, compared to a century ago, we're much less likely today to get married and stay married. And kids are much less likely to be raised in a stably married context. It's also the case, too, that marriage is less financially necessary and less culturally valued than it was a century ago. So those are reasons in part why marriage is less common in our culture. My research of late has been really focusing a lot on the last half century, so I can kind of talk about that in more detail. I would note, just for instance, that the marriage rate's fallen by about 65% since 1970. It looks like basically for the first time, probably in forever in the U.S., less than 1 in 2 adults will be married at this point in time. And as I look at this issue too, I'm actually more concerned today about sort of the way in which I think marriage is slipping out of the hands of young adults and their future than I am about kind of kids per se. And that's because marriage has lost ground in the broader culture and because people are having fewer kids in the broader culture, what that means is that family formation is now more selective for people who are relatively more educated, relatively more affluent, and relatively more religious. And so those folks are more likely to be married, and they're more likely to be stably married compared to, say, folks who are getting married and having kids in the 1970s. So that's sort of, in some ways for you, that's good news. What that means is we're seeing actually a slight uptick in the share of kids who are being raised in stably married parents. But the bad news here, right, is that because more and more young adults will never marry in the U.S., probably about 1/3, maybe more than 1/3. I mean, we're kind of in record demographic territory here for kind of people who will never have the benefit of a spouse. And as someone who studies this issue, someone who's been married for 28 years, that makes me sad, to be blunt. So that's the big picture. I also want to say one more thing, and we can talk more about this in a second, but I think in a day and age when we're seeing a more economically unequal society, in a day and age where people are too devoted to their screens, in a day and age where many of our core community institutions, both religious and secular, are relatively weaker, in this moment, I think actually it's the case that both for adults and for kids, marriage matters more than ever because it does give them this core sense of solidarity, this core social place where they can both give and receive love and, attention, comfort, touch. I mean, I think we're seeing a decline in physical touch in our society. And actually, we're animals. We're social animals. We have opportunities to touch, to snuggle, all that kind of stuff. So I think for kids, arguably, and this is certainly an arguable hypothesis, it's probably the case that moving forward that having the benefit of married parents will be even more consequential than it has been, say, 30 or 40 years ago.
Yes. One of the things that you've written about that I'm eager to talk to you about is I think what you've called the marriage divide, where poor and lower income families are getting married at much lower rates. But before we get there, Brad, can you give us a rough sense of the numbers on this? So in 1970, compared to now, what percent of people are or are not married overall? And then I would love to talk more about how you're seeing that, how you've in your research has shown that breaking down among different social and economic classes.
Sure. So, I mean, again, I would say that more than 80% of adults coming up 30 or 40 years ago would marry at some point in their lives. And we're seeing that number drop to probably around 60 to 65% for young adults today, maybe even lower. So just a huge shift for adults. Now, for kids, again, we're seeing a slight uptick in the share of kids who are going to be raised by married parents. I'd say more than 50%. But if we're looking at how this would have been, say, for kids being raised in the 1960s, about 80% of them would have been raised by stably married parents. And that falls to less than 50% in the 1970s and 80s because of the divorce revolution in that moment. Since 1980s, we've seen a slight downturn in divorce, and basically non-marital childbearing has stabilized since 2009. So again, because marriage has become more selective in recent years, that's why we've seen a slight uptick in the share of kids raised in stable marriage.
But just for our listeners who might be not familiar with this issue, that sounds like a massive sea change. Sort of the personal lives of people in our society are structured. I mean, if you're going from 80% of people being married to around 60%, that's getting to almost a half and half situation.
No,
right?
Totally. And this is all stratified. So what we're seeing is that when it comes to class and race and ethnicity, that the vast majority of Asian American parents are stably married. A clear majority of white parents are stably married. Hispanic parents are pretty much even, basically. African-American parents are not as likely to be married, stably married parents. And then when it comes to class, a huge divide. So for the top 40%, the vast majority of kids are being raised in married parent families. For the bottom 60%, it's a little bit less than half. And then when it comes to divorce, we see is that Americans who are in that top 40%, Americans also who are college educated, tend to be stably married, and their kids enjoy stable married families. And then Americans who don't have that college degree, Americans who are in the bottom 60% in terms of household income, are much more likely to see their kids experiencing divorce or cohabitation or single parenthood and some kind of family instability, all of which are bad for kids. And so what this means is there's kind of a fundamental marriage divide in America where college educated and more affluent and also more religious families tend to enjoy the benefit of a stable marriage for them and for their kids. And Americans who don't have those kinds of advantages vis-a-vis the family are much more likely to experience a kind of relationship carousel, a relationship go round. And so that means that kids in working class and poor families are often doubly disadvantaged. Their parents have less money, less education, sort of the socioeconomic stuff, and their parents are more likely to be moving through a carousel of relationships, which is bad for kids. And so in that sense, kids in the working class and poor parts of this country, have a lot going against them today.
Yes. So just to kind of underscore the way you open this, I think it's easy to misunderstand these ideas that you're sharing as being judgmental of families, right? Being kind of narrow in thinking about what an appropriate family is. But what I hear you saying is you're really just describing, as you'd said at the outset, on average, looking at what conditions are important for child well-being, what conditions are, I think you actually have research, which I don't think you've talked about yet, on the relative level of happiness among people. So you're saying that for the well-being of both children and adults, on average, this matters. And your research is just simply showing that. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I think the weird thing about this debate, obviously, is that we talk about education, right? So, I mean, there are many kids growing up here in America today whose parents were not college educated, right? And no one would be in any way offended if you said that, on average, kids benefit from going to college and graduating from college. Like, yeah, lots of nods. And then if I say, many kids today are growing up in homes where their parents were not stably married, and yet they would benefit if they were able to forge a stable marriage for themselves. That parallel comment gets a lot of people upset. And that's because, I think we feel like there's more of a moral dimension to marriage than there is to college education. But I think empirically, as a social scientist, we have to acknowledge these are two core institutions, higher education and marriage. They both, in different, distinct ways, have major implications for people's lives, life chances, incomes, health. So this is what I'm doing, is just explaining that to folks in hopefully a way that's accessible and comprehensible. But yes, it is contested in the sort of elite culture in ways that the benefits of education are not. Now, the other piece here, right, is that we have at the Institute for Family Studies just released a new research brief, and that brief suggests that on a number of key outcomes for kids, it's not just that marriage matters. It's that marriage matters more than ever for our children. Again, in a world where there's a lot of social, what we call anomie, disconnections unfolding for people. So having the benefit of stably married parents who are there with you and for you, I think in this day and age is more consequential. So what I'm talking about empirically is that when it comes to college graduation, when it comes to reaching the middle class or higher, when it comes to school suspensions, we're seeing evidence across different studies that kids who are in stably married parents are not just doing better than their peers in unstable families or in single parent families, they're doing relatively better today than would have been the case 60 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years, depending upon the study and the cohort. And so this is based upon research from scholars at Vanderbilt, a colleague, Nicholas Zill, who's a psychologist. It's based on research done by scholars at the University of Chicago and NYU. So different scholars in different places looking at different outcomes are finding, and not for every outcome, to be honest and clear here, but for a number of key outcomes related to education and behavior and financial well-being, that kids who've been raised by their own married parents, again, are not just doing better, but the gap, in a sense, between kids from married parent homes and kids from other kinds of homes is growing on these kinds of outcomes.
Yes. So you've written about, I guess, kind of two broad categories of ways to address this. One is government policy, and the other is kind of civil society. And I would love to talk about both of those, starting with the government policy. So several things that you've been proposing. One of them is ending government policies that penalize marriage, which I would love to hear more about. And then on the kind of flip side of that, what government policies could help to promote marriage, which, as I'm understanding it, is sort of strengthening families' financial well-being and strengthening what I think you've called sort of the pool of marriageable men. So I'd like to start with the ending government policies that penalize marriage. What are those and why are they there?
Yeah, so what we see is that, we have a kind of approach to low-income family policy that basically has a threshold, and so you get access to Medicaid, for instance, if your income falls below a threshold. You get access to childcare subsidies, as you know, if your income falls below a certain threshold. And that's a way of kind of saving money for the American taxpayer. It makes perfect sense. Now, the problem here, though, is that when people are thinking about kind of reporting their household income to Uncle Sam or to some other kind of public agency, they kind of begin to realize that if they stay officially single and just the mom goes to report her income, they're going to have access to a bigger suite of benefits. Whereas if they get married and report their joint income, they're going to often either lose a benefit or they're going to get less of a benefit. So I mentioned that couple in Virginia, actually, who were cohabiting at time one, two girls, young girls at that point, and they seem pretty traditional in many respects. I'm like, what's going on here? As I was talking to them, and they said, well, actually, if we were getting married, we lose access to the Medicaid program in Virginia. And so only when this guy's income went up later and I think he switched companies and had access to private medical insurance did they get married. So the point I'm making here is that unfortunately, and this is really hitting working class couples hardest, because if you're truly poor, your income, even as a married couple, would fall below the threshold. If your income is like between, say, $25,000 and $55,000, and you've got one or two or three kids, then it often makes sense from a purely financial perspective not to get married, just to cohabit and have mom apply for Medicaid or childcare subsidy or the earned income tax credit or food stamps, whatever it might be. So that's one issue. And so the way that I think we could deal with that is just to have basically a higher threshold for married families with kids under the age of 5. So as people are kind of getting launched into their family life, it'd be clear to them that there's no financial penalty in that working class bracket for getting married. That's, I think, one way to deal with that working class.
So that just seems like common sense, right? The idea that a mother who is on paper single, her reported income is below this level, so she's getting this support. But if she gets married, then she's reporting the joint income and she loses those benefits. That seems to make no sense. What are the arguments against what could be seen as just making that more rational?
So the folks who are concerned about addressing this would say it would cost more money to raise the threshold for married families, and that the evidence that it really matters is not that large. I can point to surveys that say that 1 in 10 lower-income families mention this as an issue. There's good social scientific evidence that specific penalties of $1,000, a couple $1,000 are related to people's decision-making. So I think there is evidence that this is an issue for some working class, especially families. I think it's also a justice issue, that we shouldn't be penalizing this core institution. And the other, I think, tragic thing is that we actually have addressed many of the marriage penalties facing tax-paying families whose incomes tend to be in the upper half. But we haven't addressed these marriage penalties facing people who are receiving means-tested programs in America, who, unfortunately, as we've just been mentioning, are the ones most likely to experiencing single parenthood, cohabitation, et cetera. So what the federal government did in the last 2 decades, basically, is it addressed marriage penalties facing the most privileged families, but left the ones hitting the most vulnerable families intact. And that was and is obviously unacceptable. So that's, I think, one thing we could do to address this issue.
Yes, very interesting. So those are the government policy. That's the government penalizing marriage part. And you've also talked about several ideas for government policies that would promote marriage, strengthen career and technical education apprenticeships, subsidizing lower income work, expanding the child tax credit. Can you talk about each of those, where those ideas come from? Why would that matter?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm trying to think about these days is the way in which a lot of our boys and young men are floundering. And as they become 20-something guys, that affects their marriageability, both in their own eyes and the eyes of potential partners. Because if guys have not gotten a decent education, if guys are not gainfully employed on a full-time basis, they are much less likely to be dating and to get married as well. So we have to think about bridging the gap between boys and girls in our schools and our high schools and our colleges and technical, obviously, schools as well. And that means, in part, I think, rethinking kind of how we do primary and secondary education, being open to, for instance, for elementary schools, more recess for kids. I think it's important for boys, especially to get that runaround time. Doing more single-sex schools, but also, when that's not possible, more single-sex activities in school to kind of give boys opportunities to they tend to learn somewhat differently. They're more competitive, for instance. And they're more likely to be competitive if they're just kind of competing against boys rather than boys and girls in the classroom. So kind of figuring out ways that we can kind of unleash boys' interest in education. And that would kind of prepare them better for the future. We also see, too, when it comes to vocational education, that career academies have been successful in kind of connecting young men to trades that give them good jobs and decent wages, and then also increase their marriageability as well. So on the education front, we just need to be thinking about bridging that gender gap in our schools and kind of doing more to improve the quality and the status of what was classically called vocational education, to steer more young men in that direction, which will then, I think, redound to the benefit of them and families formed down the road, including marriages. So that's part of thinking about kind of the policy agenda when it comes to families. Also thinking, too, about the way in which we could promote what's called the success sequence in our public schools and obviously private schools as well. And this is the idea that if you get at least a high school degree, you work full-time in your 20s, and you get married before having kids, your odds of being poor are just 3%.
For people who aren't familiar, so the success sequence, you're saying, has 3 components. And the idea is that if you do these steps in a particular sequence, it works better. Can you explain what those steps are, and where did people getting this idea that doing those steps in that order are more likely to lead to success?
So this sort of idea really comes in part from work done by Ron Haskins and Bell Sahel at the Brookings Institution. And they're also drawing on some other work that's been done in this space. But just basically the idea here is it's not rocket science, is that there are sort of 3 core pillars to flourishing financially, but also I would say just generally in the U.S. And those 3 pillars are, again, education, work, and marriage. And there's another report that was done by AEI and Brookings a while back, also underlining the way in which these 3 institutions tend to benefit kids and adults. When it comes to the success sequence, the idea is that getting at least a high school degree, having had some experience in connection to the workforce on a full-time basis, and then getting married before having kids just puts you in a much better position to start a family. And so we should kind of be telling our young adults, our teenagers, our middle schoolers, that it's beneficial to get that high school degree, have some experience in the workforce, and then get married before having children, putting the kind of baby carriage after marriage so that you're just in a good spot. And today, about 40% of kids are born outside of marriage. And we're also seeing, too, that a lot of younger men are not working full time. And so I think the success sequence is a way of kind of just reminding people that there are these tried and true pathways that tend to lead to financial success and stability. And we should at least alert them to, the power of both work and marriage.
As I understand it, there's a pretty impressive gap in, for example, poverty rates between people who follow those 3 steps, finish their education, establish themselves in the workforce, and then get married before having children. That following those steps in that order is correlated with remarkably lower rates of, for example, poverty. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, if you follow all 3 of those steps, your odds of being poor in your late 20s and 30s are just 3%. So 97% of young adults who follow the sequence are not poor by the time they hit their late 20s and 30s. And if we kind of break it out more by piece, what we see is that folks who graduated from high school, about 70% of them are avoiding poverty. Folks who have a full-time job, about 84% of them are avoiding poverty. And folks who get married before having kids, about 97% of them are avoiding poverty. And in a kind of a multivariate context, we're putting all these variables together and kind of looking at how they're linked to the odds of beating poverty. what we see in that kind of more multivariate context is that, for instance, young adults who put marriage before parenthood are 60% less likely to be poor compared to young adults who put baby carriage outside of marriage or before marriage. So that's just sort of one example of how this sort of plays out in the real world.
So just to loop back to a couple of the other government policies that I'm really curious about, another one that you've talked about is subsidizing lower income work. What do you mean by that, and what are your thoughts on that?
So one idea here is we're trying to think about ways to sort of make the financial foundations of family life stronger. Right now what we have is the earned income tax credit, and that subsidizes people's income in kind of working class and middle class context, kind of depending upon their family configuration. And the main concern there is that the way that sort of plays out is that it can penalize marriage in certain kinds of contexts. And so one alternative sort of model here would be to subsidize work for Americans whose income falls below the median. Now, of course, one challenge there is you also think about people where like one spouse is earning a lot of money and the other spouse is earning maybe $45,000 as like a teacher, for instance. So you'd have to like a threshold to kind of protect against that. But the thought here is we could think about ways to subsidize the incomes of working class Americans so they would have, more income to take home for their families. And there are different models. Bell Sawhill at Brookings has proposed one model. Orrin Cass, the American Compass, has proposed a different model. But the idea here is, again, think about ways to make work more attractive and also to kind of give families more money to bring home. There's a new, actually, proposal from Scott Winship, too, that also is designed to subsidize workers as well in a more marriage-friendly way as well.
And then finally, the child tax credit. What are your thoughts on that, both on who it goes to, the amounts, various proposals to change it? What's your thinking on the child tax credit?
Yeah, so we've had obviously a number of different proposals from Senator Romney. We had a different approach from President Biden. And the different approaches, I would say, cluster in really kind of three different sort of tracks. I mean, there are some, I think, fiscally conservative Republicans who are pretty dismissive of the child tax credit. They would sort of just say, let families do as they please and let's not kind of tinker with the tax code. And that's not my view. I mean, I think we have to recognize, particularly today in a world where fertility is falling to record lows in the U.S., that there is a real opportunity cost that families and women in particular bear from having kids, and that we should try to begin to sort of address that opportunity cost and make family life more affordable by giving families a child tax credit. The opposite, I think, perspective was articulated by President Biden in a sense and many progressives, and they want to kind of give a relatively universal child tax credit of, say, $3,000 per year, often paid out on a monthly basis, without regard pretty much to income, maybe not given to the wealthiest Americans. And then the third strategy is coming from people like Orrin Cass and here Scott Winship, and sort of the second model from Senator Mitt Romney and some other people in the Senate. And their thought is we should kind of target working and middle class American families with the child tax credit, recognizing that they often face the biggest financial burdens relative to their household income for having and raising kids, but not, this is controversial, but not give money to, poor families with no income. And the thought there is we don't want to kind of reproduce the kind of mistakes we made with welfare back in the 60s and 70s by kind of giving, families with no earners a kind of steady stream of government money that will allow them to kind of stay outside of the economy and not have at least one person, one parent have some connection to the labor force. So I come down in that third model thinking that we should kind of target working middle class families with the child tax credit, and still kind of recognizing that there are programs like TANF that are designed to provide welfare and other services to families with no income. But those families often have very real problems and challenges. And just to kind of assume that we can send a child tax credit to them and not address issues related to substance abuse sometimes or other mental illness, other challenges, I think, betrays a lack of recognition about what's really happening in, too many of those households with virtually no income.
So what income range are you thinking?
So I've talked about kind of $12,000 being the sort of the threshold where you would get access to the child tax credit in sort of its full expression. You might ramp up the value of that credit from $0 at $0 to the full credit at $12,000 for previous year's income, and also might have an exemption for widows who obviously may have lost a spouse in the previous year.
Do you think there should be an income ceiling or?
Yeah, I think the threshold would be around anywhere between $100,000 and $150,000. You would phase out the child tax credit, but do so in a way as to not penalize marriage. So you might have a different threshold for how you phase out the child tax credit. But again, the thought here is you're really trying to steer that money towards working middle class families who are in their own way kind of trying to do things in the American way. And what I mean by that is we've had a long tradition in this country of kind of valuing work and just, valuing marriage. And so if you're kind of trying to do things right, you're making the sacrifices to have someone, employed in your family, making the sacrifices to have both parents in the picture, you're more likely to be in that working class, middle class category compared to being in poverty. And so you should have more support from the government for doing things the right way. Unfortunately, too many of our policies kind of reward people for not doing things the American way. And when we talk to a bunch of working class, white, Black, and Hispanic parents recently for Institute for Family Studies in Georgia, Ohio, and Texas, kind of struck by the way in which many, especially white and Black respondents in that sort of series of focus groups expressed a kind of frustration that many of their acquaintances, neighbors, cousins, whatever, people in their world who were poor and not working or not working much were often getting more benefits than they were. And they were kind of working full time, and they felt that wasn't fair. So the way that I've articulated this child tax credit is obviously going to be controversial in some precincts that you and I travel in. But I think what people who are kind of advocating for very generous policies for poor Americans don't always appreciate is that oftentimes for working class families, it feels like they're doing a lot to keep things together, and they're not getting much support from the government for doing so compared to people who are not making the effort to work full-time or close to full-time or to get and stay married.
Right. In effect, they're being penalized. They're not being penalized in the sense that they have to send money to the government, but they, I guess, could feel as though they're being penalized in the sense that there's money that other people are getting that they're not getting.
Right. And we have seen that there's work done by Richard Reeves and Bell Sawhill showing that when you look at kind of income gains, interestingly enough, they've been concentrated in recent decades among the poor and among the rich. If you look at who's kind of seen their real income rise the most, in recent decades, it's the folks in that upper third. Obviously, they've done quite well overall. But interestingly enough, it's the folks kind of in that bottom 20% of the bottom third who, because of the way in which many of our public policies have become more generous towards poor families, now have access to more resources in one way or another. So, and that came through in that, in that working class series of focus groups that we did, particularly in Ohio and Georgia.
Interesting. So, marriage is your focus. The fate of single people isn't your focus. But I can imagine this is a question a lot of people have. You said your own mother was single. There were a couple of pieces that are on the Institute for Family Studies site, which I thought were really interesting. One of them was entitled, "Where Have All the Good Men Gone?" which you wrote about college students at UVA, where you're a professor, talking about how there just aren't guys to date, much less marry. And then the other was a piece by Melanie Notkin,
right,
entitled "Not by Choice, Unmarried Without Kids, and the Truth About Life in the Otherhood."
Right.
I thought it was a very courageous piece. I was also very happy that you guys published it.
Right.
Because, as you know, her story was she's in her 50s. She'd always wanted to get married. She did absolutely everything she could to get married. And there were jerky guys who dumped her or it just didn't work out or whatever. Life happened, right? And then you look at on the other end of it, the college students that you've spoken to who are feeling quite pessimistic, it sounds like. They'd love to get married, but who are they going to marry? So this is not your focus, but what are your thoughts about how single women should think about themselves and where they fit into our society? So assuming that you're successful and a significant percentage more do end up getting married, but that may take a while. So in the meantime, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great series of questions. And so to be clear here, when I first got into kind of this research, I was the most concerned about kids, which is the focus of your think tank, and the way in which family instability and the retreat from marriage have put a lot of kids at risk. But as I've been talking to students at UVA, and I meet with a lot of students because I teach sociology of family, just been struck by how many of the women have basically expressed in one way or another that they're experiencing difficulty in finding young men who they think are worthy of dating. And there's a certain kind of concern among a subset of them about how are they going to find a marriageable guy down the road. And that, of course, dovetails with lots of different commentary in the pop culture and in the broader culture and on the internet as well. And then there's obviously a group of women who are in their 40s and 50s who, like Melanie, wanted to get married and couldn't find a guy who seemed like he would be a good prospect for marriage or relationships, whatever, didn't work out in the way that they had hoped that they would work out. And so, and this sort of also kind of matches, or maps out onto, I should say, just this trend that I'm talking about here with you, obviously, of growing, I call it the closing of the American heart, basically. A growing share of both women and men who are not going to get married, not even dating as well nowadays, too. So I think we have to have a certain degree of recognition, in some cases compassion, for people who had hoped to marry, hoped to have kids, and were not able to because we're living in a world that's a lot less, I think, marriage and family friendly at a variety of levels. So that's the observation I want to make. Now, I also would just sort of say, given this reality, it's important for married families and married adults like myself to be more intentional about having people over socially who are single, obviously, given this reality. And it will be more important as we go forward in the coming decades to do that as well, to bridge this kind of marriage divide. And then for single women, I think, I don't want to kind of get into the spot of dispensing too much advice here. I think that's probably, better for someone like Melanie who wrote for us about this. But I think, let me put it this way. For single guys, and I'm in touch with a decent number of single men, I think it's important to try to figure out which, if you're religious, to be involved in your church, or synagogue, mosque, temple, whatever. If you're not, to be involved in your local town government, or to be involved in Habitat for Humanity or something, some other kind of civic activity, to go to the gym as much as you can. I think that the danger here is that a lot of adults are going to be pretty isolated and pretty devoted to their devices. And that is a recipe for anxiety and depression and sadness like nothing else. We are social animals. And so if you find yourself single, I would just definitely be deliberate about exercising and being engaged in religious or secular communities in your town, your city, whatever.
Finding ways of staying connected with people.
Exactly.
Yes. And I think, another thought that I've had, and Melanie's also founder of an organization called Savvy Auntie, a celebration of modern aunthood,
right,
which I've not yet looked into, but I'm intending to do so, because you could see that for some subset of older single women, their own lives might not have turned out the way they had planned, but they could be a useful resource for parents and families that did, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, I think, so I've looked pretty closely at happiness for U.S. adults. So prime-aged women and men, 18 to 55, who are married with kids are the happiest Americans. But when you break that out to younger, adults, like 18 to 35, you often see that married mothers aren't doing as well as married women who don't have kids. I think that's just in part because when you're the mother of a baby or a toddler, there are a lot of stresses. Sleep, other things are challenging at that new phase of motherhood, especially. And so I think if aunties and friends who are single, for instance, can kind of be more integrated into the lives of their friends who are married with kids, it's going to be a win-win situation where they can kind of watch the kids while the couple goes out, develop relationships with those children over time, et cetera. And then it's beneficial. We know that date nights are really valuable for couples and married families. But I think also, I've certainly talked to women who are single and childless and have expressed real kind of a sense of meaning from the relationships they have with their nieces and nephews as well. So I think if we can be more intentional too about integrating friends and kin who are childless or single, into our family lives, that's good too. And I think it does mean that you have to be a little bit more flexible about how neat and tidy your house is, recognizing that things don't have to be perfect to have people over or have someone babysit for your kids or whatever else.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a very good point, because the benefit for the single person, the single person probably doesn't care about how dirty your house is. But I can admit, I think our domestic environments tend to be very private. We used to live in a world where people sort of drop by a lot. That's less common now. But I think that's actually sort of an interesting point. The number of single people who weren't, invited over because people were worried their houses were too messy. That would be, seems like a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think just, being more flexible about all this and just I don't think we do hospitality very well in this culture. And so being more intentional about hospitality is part of the answer here.
Yeah. Which in its own way could strengthen families.
Right. And I think there's no question that when we have people over in general, it's always our kids appreciate it, but you have to make the effort. And in this culture, whereas obviously in some other cultures, people are more likely just to drop in, but that's not true for our culture by and large today.
It's almost considered rude to simply phone someone without having planned it ahead of time by text or email, much less actually go to their house.
Right.
So, okay, well, just to wrap up, you have a book coming out around, I think, Valentine's Day, this coming Valentine's Day, with a wonderful title, I think going to be published by HarperCollins, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. So I am very much looking forward to having you back, Brad, after that's come out, to hear more specifically. I think we've touched on many of those themes, but I'm really looking forward to hearing more specifically about what you're focusing on in the book. Yeah,
that's great, Katharine. I look forward to returning. There's a lot of new stuff in the book, which I think will be of considerable interest to your audience. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for joining me today on Early Matters.
Thank you, Katharine.
Thanks so much to Professor Brad Wilcox for a terrific conversation, and thank you for joining us today. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and write a review so Early Matters can reach more people like you. We'll see you on the next episode of Early Matters.
You've been listening to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, produced by the Center on Child and Family Policy.